Hello, Scott Ramsey here with our weekly video Bible study. This week, we're going to be looking at the first half of Ecclesiastes chapter 1. We're going to look at verses 1 through 11 of Ecclesiastes chapter 1. And so we'll get started on that in just a moment. I did want to thank all of you who responded to last week's Bible study and had notes and comments on it. That always helps me to get some feedback from you about anything, the lighting, how fast I'm talking, uh, words that I use that you don't understand. Sometimes I might use some jargon that you don't understand what I mean. Or I might just say something that needs more explanation. So feel free anytime to just make a comment or send me a direct message on Facebook through Messenger. And I'll appreciate that very much. I don't think I've I don't think I've snapped back at anybody who made a comment to me. Uh, you people are very kind and very supportive. I've not had a lot of bad or negative feedback, but I'm open to what you have to tell me, and that can be very helpful, especially since this is for us. This is for you. Uh, I want it to be effective for you and for other people to hear and to learn from. So comfortable just letting me know what needs to change or what would make it better. Okay, enough of that. Next point. I've already decided what study I want to do after the book of Ecclesiastes, and I think it will be one that will be valuable for all of us. It's going to be several weeks. I think it's a 12-part study. It's one that I did about 2 or 3 years ago, uh, partly online. It was not through my Facebook channel, or my YouTube channel. It was on Facebook, but it was live with someone else, with Joe Core. I'm going to do that study over in this format, and it's going to be a study based on how to interpret the Bible. And the book that I'm going to use to as a template for that, as a basis for that, is a book called How to Read the Bible for All That It's Worth. And this is by two authors named Stewart and Fee. And maybe you've read it before, maybe you haven't. But basically, the approach that the book takes is it looks at the different kinds of literature in the Bible, and it sets certain standards, certain ideas that are important to keep in mind when you're looking at, for example, prophecy. Uh, when you're looking at prophetic literature, what are some principles you need to keep in mind about that kind of literature when you're interpreting that kind of literature, or when you're interpreting an epistle, or you're interpreting a gospel, or you're interpreting a historical narrative like Genesis. And so I think we'll be going through that. It's going to take us a while to get through Ecclesiastes. I don't have any idea how many weeks, but we'll take our time like we've done the last one. It's 12 chapters. And so we'll take our time to get through Ecclesiastes. And then we're going to do a series called How to Interpret the Bible how to read the Bible for all that it's worth. It's going to be about how to interpret biblical literature. So I hope that will be something you will enjoy. I did this class also in Kenya twice. I did this class in 2011 and also in 2014. And so I've taught this class. And so I taught it, I guess I taught it 3 times altogether in Kenya in 2011, in Kenya in 2014, and in Stephenville in 2000, I think it was 19. Um, but I think it's very helpful. A lot of people have told me they really appreciated it, thought it was very helpful to them and their understanding of the scriptures and about how to approach the Bible looking for the intended message to the first hearers or readers of the message. What was the intended message? I won't go any farther right now, but that's a main argument that this book makes, that we're looking for what was the intended message, not what can I make this say that agrees with me, or what can I make this say that makes me feel good. Or if I'm trying to argue with the Bible, what can I make this say that is clearly not true? And so we want to avoid those kind of things. We want to look at what was the intended message. And we'll get into all that later. But that's always something to keep in mind. And it kind of comes into play today. Because as I mentioned last week, when we started talking about Ecclesiastes, this book is very different in that it's written as almost as a negative example about how to approach life. You think about the Psalms, which is also a wisdom book in the Bible, is written largely out of someone's experiences with God. Either David or one of the other writers is writing about their experiences with God. And they're not all positive. Sometimes they're very positive. Sometimes the experience is praise or thanksgiving or thanking God for his care and his providence. Sometimes the writer might be scared, might be angry, might be brokenhearted, might be convicted of sin. And so it's very honest in that sense. But his response, the things that he says he wants to do and be, and the things he calls his reader to do and be, are positive things towards God. If you think about the Proverbs are a book of what I would call positive advice. Uh, you'll have a verse or two that says, the righteous man does this and the fool does this. And so there are some negative examples in the book, but it's arguing towards getting you to do the positive. A wise man does this. Do this. The first 9 chapters of Proverbs is written is calling for the reader to be wise, to seek knowledge, to do the right thing, to have a fear of the Lord. When you get to Ecclesiastes, the tone kind of changes. Ecclesiastes is very, I would say, when I read the book of Ecclesiastes, I hope that you've read it. I hope you read at least the first chapter. I hope you read the whole thing. Comes across as very pessimistic, very limited, a very limited view of life. There's a reason for that. This book was written by Solomon, but he writes it as a character called the teacher. And the teacher is going to teach us in this book what is a worldly view of life. That's why it seems so pessimistic and limited. But that's what he's doing. He's going to teach you what is a worldly view of life. Now, one of the hints to this I touched on last week is that there's this phrase that's used 29 times in this book, the phrase under the sun. The writer will say, for example, there's nothing new under the sun. Or this is what life is like. Men toil under the sun. Or men's lives are lived out under the sun. Think about this phrase as being a way that this teacher is describing his own approach to life, which is, I look around and this is what I see. It's all about this world. It's all about what he sees and understands apart from God. And I was thinking about this afternoon uh, when I was finishing work on this study to record this today. And I hadn't thought about it before, but I think this is really true. When you think about what he says in this book, I'm going to take just a moment to thumb through some of this book. Think about writers like Jeremiah, or even the writer of the book of Exodus will say, then the Lord said this, or the Lord told them this, or the Lord showed them this, or led them here. Think about Ezekiel and Daniel, how he will say, the word of the Lord came to me, or just the visions that Daniel get. He will say, God showed me this. Okay. But I want you to listen to this series of ways that the different paragraphs are introduced in this book of Ecclesiastes. I'm just going to read some of them to you. Okay. Chapter 113. I devoted myself to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under heaven. Verse 16. I thought to myself. Chapter 2, verse 1. I thought in my heart. Chapter 4. I undertook great projects. Chapter 17 of chapter 2, verse 17. So I hated life. Chapter 3, verse 16. And I saw something else under the sun. Chapter 4, verse 1. Again, I looked and saw all the oppression that takes place under the sun. Chapter 4, verse 7. Again, I saw something meaningless under the sun. Chapter 5, verse 13. I have seen a grievous evil under the sun. Chapter 6, verse 1. I have seen another evil under the sun. I noticed two things about all these phrases. One is he is limiting his view. He's saying what I see here on earth, what I see with a limited view. Okay. And also notice it's very much about him. Nowhere have I read to you the phrase, the Lord showed me, or the Lord says, or the Lord enlightened me, or showed me this thing about what he's doing. This is a worldly view of life. Let's see, chapter 7, verse 23. All this I tested by wisdom, and I said, it's all about him. It's him in his best attempt as a totally worldly person. Now, understand, I'm not saying this book is not inspired by God. This book is inspired by God. This book is a beautiful picture. Not beautiful. It's kind of pessimistic and limited, but it's beautifully well done picture by God of what the human mind sees in life. This book is very much a picture of looking at life without God. This book can help you and I remember what life was like before we knew him. It can help you and I recognize sometimes those thoughts that click back into our mind. When it starts to seem to you like, oh yeah, I was just thinking that the other day about life. Okay, that means those thoughts are still in us. We still need to deal with those. It also is a very helpful tool in helping us understand the way that our lost neighbors and friends and family members are still viewing life. they see life on this earth without God. Now, they may have some conception of God or some hope in God, maybe, but if they don't know Christ yet, their eyes are not opened to see life completely different as ours are open. Even with our eyes open, sometimes we fall back into those same patterns. So, this book is inspired by God. What I mean by that is to say that he inspired the writing of this book by one of the wisest men that ever lived. His project here is to show us what life looks like without God, so that we can avoid those thoughts, so that we can reach those who are thinking that way, and so that we can uh, recognize the truth about who God is, which Solomon, in the last chapter of this book, will address that. He will say, here is the truth. All right. But for this chapter right now, I will read you a part of this chapter we're talking about today. The first 11 verses. It's kind of depressing, okay? Because it is a view of what life is like under the sun, with no view for God and no accounting for who God is and what God does. And so let's just get into the first chapter and read that. I'm going to use my glasses. The words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. And so Solomon is telling us, I'm writing this. You need to know who the teacher is, which means, I think, this is my thought, that he is telling us, I have found myself thinking this way. I have approached life this way in the past. I know better now. Okay. But he's saying, these are my words. He's saying, this is who I used to be. I used to be the teacher. And here's his words, verse 2 and following. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. Yours may say vanity. Yours may say pointless, meaningless. Mine says meaningless. This is the New International Version. The word in Greek is the word hevel. It basically says hevel, hevel, all is hevel. And that's really a vapor or smoke, like we said last week. Life, that's what life is. He's saying without seeing God, without understanding God's place in our life and his rightful place in our hearts and in our lives, life is meaningless. It's just smoke. And James kind of talks about this for a couple of verses in his book that we looked at before we did Ecclesiastes. He said, your life is a vapor. And so he reminded us that our life here on earth is a vapor. So that's hard to hear sometimes. We don't like that because we think our life is everything. My life is everything, but it's just a vapor. But let's see what he has to say about this meaningless life. I want you to notice something in verses 3 through 11. It's a poem, and it makes the same point over and over again. And when we get to the end of it, we'll talk about what that point is. What does man gain from all his labor, at which he toils under the sun? Generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun sets, and hurries back to where it rises. The wind blows to the south, it turns to the north, ever returning on its course. All streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place the streams come from, there they return again. Things are wearisome, more than one can say. The eye never has enough of seeing, and the ear its fill of hearing. So what has been will be again, and what has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one can say, look, there is something new? It was here already long ago. It was here before our time. There is no remembrance of men of old, and even those who are yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow. So, what is the point that he's trying to drive home in this poem that he just wrote here? Think about that. Think about what you really have here is you have verses 2 through 11. Almost every verse has the same message, and they all have a common field of messages. What's the message? Pick any one of those verses and tell me, what does that verse tell you about life? Well, we know it tells us it's meaningless because that's the message of the whole book. But one of the things that makes life so meaningless is that it has no beginning and it has no end, which we as human beings interpret as it has no purpose or meaning. Also, you see this monotony over and over and over again. The same thing happens over and over and over again. The wind blows. This day it comes from the north. The next day it comes from the south. Next week it'll come from the north, and then it'll come from the south. He's making an observation about life, that life is monotonous. It has no point. And there seems, in his view, on an earthly level, to be no sense of progression, no sense of making progress. Because after you live your life, you die and you're forgotten. It's not, like I said, this is not a happy book, but it's got some things for us to understand that this is how life appears to mankind without God. And I would say this, the form of this poem even makes the point that each of the verses make. Because this is 10 verses of the same message 10 times. He uses different examples from life: the rain, the wind, the sun and the moon, people being born and growing old and dying and being forgotten. Over and over again, he uses different ways to teach the same message. And by doing it 10 times in a row, he's saying, look at this writing. This writing, if you're getting tired of hearing this verse over and over again, then you're experiencing just exactly what I'm talking about. I'm beating you down with this sense of a lack of progress. A lot of times Hebrew poetry will have one verse that has two parts that have a message that's the same message. Sometimes it'll be two, sometimes as many as three. But this is 10 verses, each of which points to the meaninglessness of life. Meaningless because it makes no progress. because it's the same thing over and over and over again. And so the writer has built this poem so that he makes his message clear in the words that he uses, but also the way that he